more net zero continues. Sorry about that. And it is set to be law by 2050. Our sector has a big role to play in leading the journey to net zero. This is a big opportunity for us to reposition our industry from the big smoky factories to leaders in the green and digital revolution. We want to be a part of the solution and not the problem. This is also a commercial opportunity, as businesses are already looking at their green credentials and that of their trading partners. Engaging and collaborating with the supply chain is very important to identify where your Scope 3 emissions come from and how to minimize them and add value to your products and services. So, thank you for joining us and taking the time out of your very busy days. I'd like to set some housekeeping rules and advise you that today's session is being recorded so that you can share it with your colleagues. Please, could you remain on mute unless invited to speak? And can we ask that you ensure that your name and your company name is displayed? Questions in the chat box will be moderated by my colleague, Annette Hobson, and she will ensure that all questions are put to the panel. Excuse me, I think I'm going to cough. I'd now like to welcome our partners, Adam Baker and Daniel Crowe from Energy and Carbon Management, and also our Energy and Climate Lead, Brigitte Amoruso, who is leading Make UK's policy work on net zero. I'd like to welcome and thank Richard Hogan, Managing Director of Crystal Doors, an SME who's leading the way on net zero, and who will show us how they are engaging with their supply chain on their Scope 3 emissions. Can I hand over to you now, Bridget? Unless, Adam, would you like to pop in and give us a recap on sessions 1 and 2 before we do a snap poll?
After you, Brigitte.
Right, hello everyone, and welcome to this workshop. So actually, it would be a good thing just to start with a short snap poll so we can gauge where we all are at the moment. So I'm going to start this. So I hope everyone can see. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good.
Everybody's just about completed there, Brigitte.
Yes. Shall I stop there? Okay, good. So hopefully if I end it, yes, I can share the results. Well, I see it's really good news that actually, okay, only 14% of you are engaging with your supply chain, but a vast, half are planning to, which means that, you know, a vast majority will be engaging. So that's really good news. And there's still a little bit of uncertainty there with 14%. Sorry, I guess it's here that you can see the results. Then for question 2, have you been prompted by your supply chain to provide your own carbon footprint emissions? So the majority have said no, and yeah, about a fifth have said yes. So it will be interesting to see that in a few months' time, if we can do the poll again, because it's a trend that's probably increasing. But it's interesting to see that most of you haven't been prompted, and nevertheless you are planning to engage with it, with the supply chain. And finally, has your carbon footprint had any influence on your ability to conduct your sales activities? Interesting that actually already nearly 20% have had some influence. So, and another 20% not sure. So that's very interesting. I'll stop sharing here, and then we can go into the meat of the workshop. So thank you again, and welcome to this workshop, which focuses on supply chain and collaboration. And as you have seen, so we'll have a short introduction. We've had the first snap poll. We'll have Adam Baker and Daniel Crow talking about the actual, what are, scope 3 emissions and net zero and your supply chain. Then we'll have a couple of real life examples, and then a Q&A session and a snap poll again. So here's the hand over to Adam from Energy and Carbon Management, and Daniel Crow from Inspired Energy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon and listening to what is episode 4 in the Demystifying Net Zero series. As Dawn and Brigitte said, first I'm going to do a quick recap of the first 2 episodes, particularly, which focus on the kind of net zero aspects. So if we could have the next slide, please. So in episode 1, we talked about how to get to net zero. So, fundamentally that this process begins with data collection, with understanding kind of your starting position. By understanding, all of that information, you give yourself the ability to set a baseline and therefore have an idea of what a target might look like that's realistic and proportionate and appropriate to your business. Next, please. That's great, thank you. So effectively, the first thing to understand is how to look for the basics, to look for the simple solutions to your energy efficiency opportunities. So behavioural change, understanding data, monitoring what you already do, looking for the simple, low-hanging, no-cost, low-cost options to impact ultimately your carbon footprint, your net zero position. When you've looked at those, you talk about the benefits and the positive impact that's had, and you, as we would describe it, you disclose and review what it is that you've achieved. You then start looking at the bigger ticket items, so process efficiencies, new equipment, new plant, upgrades, potential shift pattern changes, and anything that starts costing more significant sums of money, but starts probably having bigger step changes on both your energy use and ultimately your carbon footprint. Then in theory, you should start considering on-site generation. But as we talked about in a number of the previous episodes, you may well have done some of the on-site generation, particularly solar tends to be something that's been looked at already. And there's nothing wrong with that, because the journey to net zero isn't linear. Lots of businesses will take slightly different routes. Next click, please. And then at the end of the process, in theory, at the end of the process, you will then look at your green energy procurement and then ultimately looking at opportunities to offset whatever carbon you have left. And we always talk about the offsetting at the end, because one of the theories is that you offset the least amount at the end in order to do that most cost effectively, I suppose, really. Although there is a counter argument to say to start with offsetting and then look at alternate schemes. backwards off that, but that's something called carbon insetting, which is perhaps a conversation for further down the line. Next slide, please. Can everyone see the slides? Just as I can see, there's a comment in the chat that someone can't see the slides on screen.
I can see them. I don't. We haven't had any.
I can see them.
I can see
I
them.
can see them. They're on.
Great.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's resolved itself then if somebody can't see them. So in episode 2, in episode 2, we introduced, one more click, please. We introduced the idea of understanding your data. So understanding your data is effectively meaning to understand your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So these are the direct and indirect emissions that your business creates through its activities. And they are the direct impacts are heating fuel, company car fleet, commercial vehicles, on-site generators, and any other kind of fugitive gases. So refrigerants is the most typical example. And then obviously your scope 2 is your indirect. So primarily for most businesses, that's your energy and gas usage on site. And that's normally the sum total of people's appreciation of kind of understanding their carbon footprint. What Dan, Daniel Crowe, who's about to talk to you about, Dan's now going to introduce the next phase of the process, and that is to start considering your scope 3 emissions.
Hi, thanks, Adam. Thanks for the introduction. So as Adam said, looking at it from the point of view of a business reporting their carbon footprint, measuring it at this stage, scope 1 and 2 are about what they control inside their own operations, be that combustion and gas releases in scope 1, or purchasing in energy, which has an associated emission somewhere else, which is scope 2. That's mostly electricity with a bit of district heating. Electric vehicles goes into scope 2 as well, as you can imagine. But I wanted to talk about scope 3, which is how we quantify the emissions associated with your business's value chain. It's often called supply chain, but there's also elements that go beyond your supply chain into your employees and what happens to your product after it leaves your factory gate or your shop shelf. That's why it's referred to as value chain. All of it's chopped up into 15 different categories. This is a really big area. You measure it in order to try and start taking some responsibility for it and look at parts of your scope 3, parts of your value chain outside your own operations that you can place levers and affect the wider I suppose economy and how carbon intensive it is and how you can help the country and the world as a whole get towards net zero. So that's why you measure scope 3. The classic ones are things like the emissions associated with waste going to landfill. That's category 5, waste disposal. So if you imagine a biological material decomposing in a landfill site, that's happening at someone else's site. It's not your scope 1, but because you threw that waste away, it's your scope 3. The other classic one is within business travel, so air travel. So you can decide whether to take the flight or not, and you can quantify the emissions from taking that flight, but it's still British Airways scope 1. That's something that we'll touch on a lot, is that scope 3 is, and I can't think of any, I don't think there are any exceptions. Scope 3 is always someone else's scope 1 emission. And in the case of electricity, someone else's scope 2 as well. So it's by its own nature a double counting. But the point is that you can take responsibility for it to an extent. Next slide, please. Oh, I've got a few things dropped in there at once, but that's okay. So scope 3 is always outside your business's direct control. It's always someone else's scope 1 and or 2, but you can influence it. When quantified, before you can even start trying to measure it, manage it, it's usually very large and often more than 90% of your carbon footprint. And there's a few real examples here, anonymized. The only case that I can think of where scope 3 isn't very large is in the very sort of heavy primary industries where their own scope 1 is enormous, perhaps steel and that kind of industry. But generally, particularly in the more typical workshop and assembly manufacturing, scope 3 is generally the largest. Could we next click, please, Brigitte? So this is one for one of the leading supermarkets. They're quite energy intensive. They have a lot of refrigeration as well. So their scope 1 and 2, including their transport, is quite significant, but their scope 3 is still the majority. If you imagine all the emissions associated with producing the food that they sell, it's quite significant. And also all their other activities like waste and travel. A packaging manufacturer, so they're taking raw materials and turning it into packaging and then selling it. The vast majority of their scope, of their own carbon, of their total carbon footprint is scope 3, because that accounts for the forestry going into produce the paper for their manufacturing, the plastics industry supplying with the raw materials, and then amongst other things, the emissions associated with transporting the packaging by third parties and its disposal at the end of its life. There are carbon emissions associated with its landfilling or recycling as well. And we see a very similar thing, although for different categories, in the next one, please, which is a commercial landlord. So the bulk of the energy and emissions associated with a commercial landlord who own a fleet of offices and warehouses, should we say, a portfolio, but the bulk of the emissions aren't in the operation of the buildings. It's in the construction of the buildings, the use of the buildings by the tenants, and then their end-of-life demolition. So that's an example of how a business with a very small own direct carbon footprint can influence a much larger area of emissions. Next one, please. So why would you measure and manage scope 3 if it's outside your direct control? Well, this is the way businesses can drive their suppliers and their customers and their employees, in fact, towards playing their part in a low carbon economy, and as it's become more and more common, achieving national net zero targets. Next, please. Measuring and publishing your scope 3 footprint provides much more transparency and credibility of any net zero goals you may be setting. We see more and more businesses, even on a weekly basis, committing to get to net zero by a point in the next 10, 20 or 30 years. A lot of them are just talking about their own activities. So eliminating fossil fuels and using neutralization measures, forms of offsets that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to get to net zero. And that's fine for your scope 1 and 2. But really, you need to start making levers on your suppliers and your customers as well to truly demonstrate a commitment and be credible. That's partly why we're talking about this today. You may also be getting, so if you're supplying a major manufacturer, for example, or a retailer, they're likely to be making these net zero commitments themselves, but also leaning on their suppliers to provide data to measure their carbon footprint and their own scope 3, and make changes to their own operations to help bring everybody along the line to net zero. The end goal would hopefully be to reduce supply chain costs. So if your suppliers are getting more energy efficient, spending less money, maybe they'll be more competitive and pass those price savings on to you. Obviously, it's just one element of that drives prices. And lastly, if you are minded to set a science-based target, which is kind of the gold standard for a carbon reduction target, and you get it a bit like taking an ISO accreditation, but for your carbon reduction target, it then gets validated by the Science-Based Target Initiative. If you want to go through that process, you have to prove how large your scope 3 footprint is. If it's more than 40% of your total, which for the vast majority of businesses it is, you have to set some form of target against scope 3 as well. You can't just go net zero or make drastic cuts to your own scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that's why you need to measure and manage the key reasons. Next one, please, Rajit. Measuring is always the big hurdle and the challenge. What we're looking to do here is to move on from what I call cherry-picked scope 3. You do that through, first of all, just having a stab or taking a first step to do a scoping inventory. The idea of that is to find out what's material or significant for your business. You look at all 15 categories, which I'll do a recap on in a minute. You can start each of those 15 categories. You have different ways of measuring them with a hierarchy moving up to more accurate ways of measurement. You can start for some of them, for example, for category 1 of scope 3, which refers to purchased goods and services, often the largest, which is the embedded carbon and the associated carbon with everything that you're buying in, from your stationery to the raw materials, to your manufacturing, to your IT services, similarly for capital goods. So if you know how much you spent on any given service, and you ideally which country you've been doing business with to get that service or goods, we can make estimates of what the embedded carbon is in that. So if you buy a filing cabinet made of metal, you can take a fair estimate of how much carbon is associated with that if you know how much it costs. It's not as accurate though as doing it on a unit or mass base. So you know how many tons of sand you bought to put into your process, or how many tons of steel. There's plenty of proxy data to estimate the typical carbon footprint in buying in some steel. You can then move up to what's called the hybrid method, which gets more complex, but it's a mixture of the unit and mass-based method with more accurate data on, for example, how far the material's been transported and the energy inputs along the way in its process. The product greenhouse gas inventory is the gold standard, whereby you know for that specific product you bought into your shop or into your factory, you know exactly what the embedded carbon is, what the emissions have been over the lifetime of that product. That's much harder, but you will see it. So the classic one is the bottle of Coke or the packet of Walker's crisps, where someone's done almost academic study to carbon footprint that product, and you can say, well, you bought that many, and you can with fair confidence say. So that won't be possible for most services at the moment. But as more and more businesses measure their own carbon footprints, and you can get a picture of your suppliers and what their emissions are, you can gradually move up that hierarchy. But as I say, you should start with the spend-based method, unless other better data is available, and do a screening inventory where you understand which of the 15 categories in Scope 3 are applicable to you, and they're rough, which one's a material, likely to be category 1 at least. Some won't even be applicable, as you'll see. As time goes by, improve your data quality so you can track impact. And we would generally only recommend continuing to report accurately the ones that are the biggest categories, and also ones where perhaps there's other reasons for taking action. A classic one is looking at meat products that you're buying in, track the carbon footprint of those more accurately, and look at perhaps lower or meat-free products that would have a lower carbon footprint, and track that specifically rather than everything you're buying in and selling. It also looks at products you're selling and the energy and emissions associated with them in their lifetime. That's another category. We haven't covered that on that slide, but I'll mention that in a minute. Next one, please, Brigitte. So just a recap on all the things that make up a business's carbon footprint. 2 more clicks. I think 1 or 2 more clicks, please, Brigitte. There you go. So Scope 1 is the direct scope, which is those things listed there. Scope 2 is generally electricity and other energy that you purchase from a third party that you don't combust on your site. And then Scope 3 is your value chain. It consists of two sides: your upstream activities, which is largest likely to be goods and services, either for consumption, resale, or consumption as in incorporation to your own process, manufacturing process, resale, or capital investments as well. They all have embedded carbon, and they can all be quantified to increasing degrees of accuracy as time goes by. Fuel and energy related activities, that relates to, it's quite a straightforward one. If you know how much electricity and gas and other fuels you've consumed in Scope 1, this is about their well to tank emissions. So the energy used to get that tank of diesel into your car, the electricity lost in the process of transporting electricity to your site, and so on. That was quite an easy one to quantify usually. You've done 1 and 2, Scope 1 and 2. Distribution, so that's outsourced distribution services, essentially all the fuel used to get products to your factory gate or to your shop. Waste disposal, that's emissions from disposal to landfill, and lesser so recycling of your waste from your own operations. Business travel, we touched on that, I think you can picture that. Employee commuting, so looking at where your sites are and what your employees have to do to get there, looking at ways to influence that. Leased assets, that's where you're leasing a building or a plant or a piece of equipment, the emissions associated with that. Typically, the energy in your leased buildings actually gets captured in Scope 1 and 2, but if not there, it needs to go into Scope 3. Downstream, so this is things, as opposed to upstream, where those are emissions associated with things you buy and what happens before you take ownership. Downstream is what happens after a product or a service or your money even leaves your business in a way. So the classic one is in-life operation. So if you imagine you're an OEM manufacturer, you produce a car or a boiler or an electronic device, the energy used in its lifetime will create emissions generally. And that's what the in-life operation emissions counts for. Processing is if you're an intermediary part of the supply chain. So you produce a raw material, it then goes to another manufacturer to further process. That's the energy and emissions associated with processing that into a final product or usable product. Distribution again, so things leaving your site going to a third party. End of life treatment, so that's thinking about the disposal of the things you've manufactured. What's the emissions associated with the end of life of what you've made? Can you make it more easily to recycle, for example, so there's no landfill going on and it can be done more efficiently? Less likely to be relevant to the typical manufacturers are investments, which is essentially taking a share of any businesses that you're invested in, or a share of the emissions from them. Similarly, franchises, companies operating in your name, they create emissions. What are they? And then leased assets is if you're leasing out buildings or vehicles or other plants, and what the emissions associated in their lifetime. So that's the full picture, upstream and downstream. Next one, please, Brigitte. So I just wanted to go on to, so if you're thinking about how we've measured our carbon footprint, we've gone through the process, what's the point of that really, if you can't do anything about it? Now, each of those strands will have different ways of tackling it. Ultimately, you'll want to pick some to set targets against and try and drive reductions and efficiencies. So each of them have discrete ways of doing it. And these are the upstream ones first. So for example, the goods and services is all about what you procure, either to use yourselves or, oh, sorry, a little question popped out there, either to use yourself or to resell. So that's all about choosing which suppliers you use. Maybe you want to pick ones that have better visibility of their emissions so you can measure them, and ones that are making greater efforts to get to net zero or reduce their emissions themselves. That could be through a procurement policy. You know, you only buy recyclable products that will create less emissions downstream, or ones that are from countries with a less carbon intensive energy grid, for example. It's not as easy as I'm making it out, but you can start chipping away. The fuel and energy related one, it's a bit incongruous here, but it is simply about reducing your own energy consumption, so there's less wastage in producing those fuels for you. Distribution, that's all about sourcing from places closer to you, selecting transport providers that, let's say, use shipping rather than air, use rail rather than lorries, lower carbon transport, and also working with your suppliers to, shall we say, pack things as densely as possible, so fewer trips can be made. I mean, I don't imagine there's enormous scope for improving that, because they're already very well developed, those sorts of things, but that's how you would reduce your distribution emissions. Next one, please, Brigitte. Perhaps we can do a few at a time. So reducing the amount of waste you dispose of is the classic things: increasing your recycling, being more efficient in your manufacturing process, and reducing wastage. Business travel, as we can all see, using video conferencing saves huge amounts of traveling, and that can be put in place with a travel policy. Encourage people to not travel, or to go by rail instead of car, for example. The business travel policy. Employee commuting, so you can capture that. Encourage home working, so people aren't traveling to the office every day when they don't really need to. Support cycling, so businesses might put showers and bike racks to encourage staff not to cycle to work, to drive to work. All sorts of things you can do. You can also quantify the emissions from home working through reasonable sampling and estimation techniques, so you're not ignoring them, but they will almost certainly be less than people driving to work still. Leased assets, this is a bit less relevant to the average manufacturer, but it's all about choosing choosing buildings at the point of moving into a building, and if you're already in, liaising with your landlords, finding commercial arrangements so they are encouraged to make energy efficient retrofits and so on. Next slide, please, Brigitte. So how you tackle your downstream, so emissions associated with things that happen after products leave your business. So in-life operation, this is the big one, particularly in the motoring and electrical sector. So it's about product design, making the engines and motors as efficient as possible. narrowing your or changing your product range so you're not selling high carbon products. This is important, for example, in air conditioning and heat pump manufacturers. So instead of using high global warming potential refrigerants, they can move to things like, let's say, ammonia, which doesn't have a global warming potential, as far as I understand it. And then user guidance, so they're not being wasted, so your users know how to use equipment efficiently. Processing, this is where it gets very specialist, but this is about, say, if you're making an intermediary product, you're selling sand to a cement manufacturer, you're selling an oil to a lubricants manufacturer. Is there anything you can do in your process that makes that product require less processing downstream and less overall emissions? Is there anything you can do to make it easier for your customer to use the product you've bought, you've manufactured and they've bought in their own process? So again, that gets quite specialist, but there will be efficiencies possible. Downstream distribution, so if you imagine a retailer or a wholesaler, they can make their products packaged better, so they're lighter and there's more of them per pallet. Potentially they can influence the freight method, so rail instead of lorry, and the route it takes. It's a bit harder than influencing your suppliers, but there are things you can do. End-of-life treatment, very similar to waste. That's about making products last longer so they don't have to be used as much, replaced as often, making them recyclable rather than have to be just landfilled, and including guidance for users on how they can efficiently and environmentally responsibly deal with the product that you've sold them. Investments, less relevant to this audience, but again, it's about investing in greener companies that are less carbon intensive rather than, let's say, a fossil fuel reliant business. Franchises, if you've had business, if you've got your own net zero strategy, your own energy management systems, helping your franchisees pick up those things in terms of operational support, making them be as efficient as you are as the head company, the franchisor. And then leased assets, if you're leasing out buildings, you're leasing out vehicles, it's all about what you offer to your customers and taking the lead at making those buildings energy efficient, or perhaps have their own on-site generation, rather than leaving the tenants to worry about that. And essentially no one wins, because it will never get done otherwise if the landlord isn't engaged. I was recently speaking to a vehicle leasing company, and they are rapidly moving to electrified vehicles, and then as well as purely battery electric vehicles. So that's how they can influence the assets that they're leasing out. So that's the whole of scope 3. Next one, please. So just as a little recap, those are the parts of scope 3 that we've covered. You know, a bit of a whistle-stop tour. To make changes, to quantify them, there's I suppose a hierarchy of accuracy you can do. Don't shy away from it. There's a lot you can quantify and screen to understand if it's relevant, and the indicative scale of it. You can do that. You can do, if you've got accounts for 2020, we could have a go at doing it for you. And in terms of managing it, that comes next, but there's a lot you can do, and most of it involves engagement with your suppliers and your customers. Adam, I think it's time for you to pick up again. Thanks, everybody. Any questions, please fire them in.
Thanks, Dan. There is just one question in the chat, which is probably just I have clarified it in the chat, but it was just about the double counting question again. Can you just clarify that one more time, Dan?
Yeah. So, scope 1, a reporting company, standalone company, would never double count in between scope 1, 2, and 3. So something that's in scope 3 would never appear in your scope 1. However, everything that's in your scope 3 is somebody else's scope 1. So your waste going to landfill is the landfill operator's scope 1, because it's coming out of their valves on their landfill site. Your scope 3 business travel is British Airways fuel consumption. So inherently it is at least double counting. That's essentially how scope 3 works. But just because it's someone else's direct emissions doesn't mean you can't influence it and and take some responsibility for it.
That's excellent. Has anybody got any further questions? Or
there's a few more coming in, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a few popping in at the moment, actually. Let me just.
The first one from Graham is: in a net zero scenario, I'll have a go at answering these while I read them. If we have to come back later, I'll say, in a net zero scenario, will a business be expected to pay to offset scope 3 emissions? I would say the dream scenario is that every business in the supply chain would reduce, well, absolutely minimize their own scope 1 and 2 emissions to an extent that they could eliminate or neutralize or offset their own scope, their remaining scope 1 and 2 emissions. And that way, you effectively are minimizing everyone else's scope 3 emissions at the same time. Saying that, some businesses will choose and already do offsets at least some of their scope 3. We are carbon neutral in terms of offsetting of all our scope 1, 2, and all of our what we call consumption related scope 3 emissions. So everything that we buy and consume as a company, our waste, our business travel, that kind of thing, we're carbon neutral on that. There's certainly no legislation to push people to do that, but you may choose to.
Okay. What I'm going to actually do is, if we could just push along to our next speaker, please, and we'll have a little bit more time for some questions. We'll park them just for the moment, as interesting as they are. But I do want to hand over to Richard Hogan, who is the MD of Crystal Doors, a window and door manufacturer who's very passionate about net zero, and obviously going to talk about some real life example on supply chain engagement. So can I bring you into this conversation now, Richard? And I think, is there a slide to support you from Brigitte? Yeah, here we go.
That's super. Thank you very much for inviting me here today, Make UK, and thank you very much for listening to the technical side. Crystal Doors did it completely differently. I was not an environmental specialist. I am not an accountant. I am a business leader. And for Crystal Doors, it was more about cultural change. In 2015, we got rejection from planning permission. And it was on that side, it was more about save money. It wasn't save planet at the beginning, it was about save money. How could I save money? And how could I engage with Natural England to be able to get my planning permission through? So I learned as much as I could through the internet, and that's where we got to. That last year, since lockdown, I was sent home because we were manufacturing for the Nightingale hospitals. And I then jumped on the internet and applied for 8 awards and won all 8 of them. What I do want to say is the manufacturers are the champions within the whole lot of the industries. The ED Award is the biggest for all the small companies, and we beat everybody. There's 10 finalists, and I thought they're all eco warriors, and still Crystal Doors had done enough because of our scope 1, 2, and 3, and a lot further on. IEMA is the professional body for sustainability. We beat the Bank of England, we beat all the big companies. So there is a possibility for everybody to play a game that's worth playing. Crystal Doors did not see it as a difficulty, as there's lots of data to collect and lots. I do understand everything that Daniel said, and Daniel 100% is correct in saying that if you can't measure it, you can't control it, you can't reduce it. But for me, it's get that baseline however you can, and a bit like Daniel said, is have a stab at it. Is the first time that we did our scope 1 and 2, it was sort of with boundaries of, it's not perfect, but it's as good as we can get. So therefore, what we've got to do is just keep having a go at it. So people say we've won the awards, where are we going to get to next? Afterwards is on the scope 3, which is what somebody said, is it double counting? Yes, but we're missing a huge amount out, which is this embed the carbon, or more specifically is this entire product declaration, which is the full supply chain of the carbon footprint or the impacts on the environment. And what Crystal Doors is aiming for is full circular economy, where we've got to now redesign our product. But the main one for me is this engagement as the cultural change with our suppliers and with our customers. And it's when you bring them on board, that's when you get the game changer. So the next slide, please. And this is where we have attracted more customers, because it says that we care for the planet, we care for people, and that's the reason why we're going for B Corp. It's not all about profits, it's about our ability as business leaders, as business owners, to be able to support our community, to support our employees, to support our suppliers and customers. So therefore it works well, and it enhances our reputation. Crystal Doors has got a lot more. Before I had no brand because it was a Me Too product, now we have got brand value. It's boosted our profitability because we can now put pressure on our customers and our suppliers. An example is our suppliers. It was interesting to see that 67% said that they haven't had suppliers asking them. We ask all our suppliers since February, unless you've got a carbon footprint and you can evidence that you're reducing, we won't even have a conversation. So when they come in about price and they come in, can we have a chat? The answer is, first you show me that you respect people and planet first before we even engage with you. So there is a game changer going on in the marketplace. But for us, it is about attracting and retaining the talent. Because we're working with our stakeholders at this moment in time, it is much more of a partnership, which is growing stronger and better together. And when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it is about community, it's about trust, it's about engagement, it's about the value of what you're doing. Are you just working for money, or are you working for a greater purpose? And this is where Crystal Doors has changed it to be a greater purpose, and that's where the technology and manufacturing really comes in, that we've been able to do it through the technology, through digital transformation, through investment. So therefore, it's increased our business resilience, improved our investors' confidence of people sort of saying, yes, the banks want to give us the money because they know it's able. So for me, the easy ones is baseline, exactly what Daniel said, get the quick wins, exactly what Daniel said, then look for return on investments, which is what Crystal Doors had to do because I didn't have a lot of money. Then look for the long-term goals. But for me, I didn't necessarily look at the frameworks because at that time I wasn't aware. I just did a 100 list, which is like blue sky thinking, what can I do? And I didn't realize I was ticking off those. So it wasn't a case of filling forms in and having the difficult side. It was a game worth playing, which was me just having fun, trying to say, oh, I can save money, I can do this. What do you think as employees? So everybody then became on board. And that's that change in culture. So the next slide, please. So what looks very, very difficult, if we go to the next click, it then goes green. Whoops. So purchase goods and services, that's the entire product declaration, which is difficult. So we're asking our suppliers, have you got an EPD? Can you prove what the carbon footprint is of the products that are coming into us? Therefore, we can get better on our scope 3. The capital goods is probably the hardest. You buy a big machine, you buy a car, you can't ask for the carbon footprint of the entire products. So that's a difficult one, which is where this, for Crystal Doors, we started off at 300 tonne, we've got down to 70, we'll be offsetting down to 0. Our scope 3 is also around the 300 tonne. This one could take it up to 700 if we bought a big capital, we don't know. Fuel and energy related activities, we can calculate. We've now got our suppliers, what is the distance between it? We didn't do that before. And now we're saying, can we have an EV6 vehicle because we need the carbon reduction? That means they're not going to break down. That means they're going to be on target. That means we've got a better partnership. Which is the transport and distribution. We only try and buy local. Once again, it's a good move to be able to get that partnership. The waste generated in Crystal Doors, all our operations is 99% is recycled. All the plastic sent off, all the cardboard is, and all the wood, the biomass which would have gone to landfill is now burnt in our biomass burner, and that's the only heating that we've got. So we've got an EPC rating of carbon positive for the factory. The business travel, we have 2 cars. I have a Nissan Leaf 2 for 3 years, and I have a Tesla P100D, which can do the long distances. That's it. I'm done for cars. I don't need to buy another car, hopefully, for the rest of my life. And that's the other thing, is this consumption, is slow down the consumption that we're getting. It's not the price, it's the value over the lifetime of a product, which is that cradle to cradle. The employee commuting, we've purposely taken on people under 3 miles. Now we've got this remote working. It's absolutely fantastic. We don't have any upstream lease assets. Transport and distribution, once again, we only try and supply to local. We don't want to export. The processing of solid products, ours is a wood-based product, so therefore we've got embedded carbon within it, and therefore our customers aren't changing it much, so they're not processing it much. And then when it goes to the end user, it doesn't consume electricity, it doesn't consume oil, fuel, whatever. So that is very, very small. The end of life treatment, we're trying to now get that back into the circular economy. Leased assets, none. Franchises, none. Investments, none. For the big companies, this is the difficult one. For the small companies and the manufacturer, this is a game well worth playing. It allows you to improve your brand, reduce your costs, and have fun with it. It's not an accountant's black and white. It's a case of we've got no controls. The big companies have controls that they have to prove it. We've got the game that's worth playing, and it's worth enjoying and saving money. Thank you very much for your time. Richard,
that was awesome. And how you managed to squeeze all that information in. Did you actually come up for air? It's so exciting. You make the whole thing really buzzing. And I think
it has to be exciting.
I think that's what you've got to embrace with this. Yes. But I've got to move swiftly on because we're a little bit behind on time. And I do want to introduce everyone to the chief exec and co-founder of an organisation called Loop Cycle, who are going to be talking about supply chain tracking. Lugano, are you able to shout out and let me know where you are? I can't actually see you.
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm just trying to get the slides in. Sorry, Dawn.
That's fine. That's absolutely fine.
PDF, so hopefully I can get it up here. Oh dear. Right. What? I have to stop this. I can't get it on.
To share. Have you got a copy of
maybe.
slides, Lugano?
I can also happy to share my screen if that
Yes,
that
that might
well.
be
Yep.
that might be easy. Yeah.
Shall I stop
excellent.
sharing myself then, Dawn?
You can just allow Lugano to share his screen.
So how do I do that? Sorry.
That's all right. Let's have a look.
Yes.
If you just go to share your screen, Lugano, at the bottom of the.
It says the screen sharing has been disabled.
All right. Okay.
Unable to share at the moment.
Can you manage that, Dawn? Yeah.
You just have to give permission. If you can go to Lugano's picture, 3 dots, and you can make him a co-host. Or
Yeah. Okay. Good. Oh, that's it.
and that should allow him to share.
Oh, there we go. Excellent. I'm on.
Perfect. Thank you.
Brilliant. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for having me along today. I am the co-founder and CEO of Loopcycle, and we're a relatively new business, product traceability business. We launched in February this year, and we closed our first funding round at the end of March. So recent members to Make UK, and really pleased to be able to share what we're doing, and also look at Scope 3 in terms of how do you enable Scope 3 emissions, and we see ourselves as enablers through supply chain collaboration and traceability. So I will go through these slides as quickly as I can. Oh, there we go. Right, so this is why we believe there's an issue that needs to be solved, and we see a lot of lost commercial and sustainable value, because if you look at this value chain, I believe that term's been used, and that's the same term that we use also. You have a manufacturer that manufactures a product. It then goes to an intermediary who purchases that product from the manufacturer and distributes it to a number of operators and end users. At that point, when that sale happens, the manufacturer often loses visibility on who their end users are. And in fact, one of our clients actually said that they'd be lucky if they know where 1 in 5 or 20% of all their products end up. So I guess really that creates a real challenge when we're talking about resource efficiency, circular economy, because as it's already been said, you can't really manage what you can't measure. And therefore, without knowing where your products go and where your products are, that really is a critical break in this value chain and unlocking this circular economy. So this is the problem that we solve, and we embed industrial scale traceability, particularly in B2B manufacturing value chains. And through this, this not only allows companies to start getting a grip on where their products are going and setting up systems to recover those products, but it can also open up new opportunities around how customers can manage, recover, and resell their products. And there's three elements to what we do. So the first is this idea of a digital product inventory. Now, we mentioned that manufacturers have a visibility problem of their operators and their end users, but also even the end users themselves have a visibility problem. A lot of our customers are in the kind of restaurant sector, and end users are in the restaurant sector, hotels, and they have various sites where they actually don't have a clear inventory of the products that are actually at each of these sites. So that creates problems with regards to collecting products to recycle, but also that creates problems with regards to asset maintenance as well. So that's a problem that we also solve. And within all that, we have this reuse marketplace. The idea that at the end of a use cycle, once a customer has finished using that product, they can then sell and exchange those products in a trusted marketplace with other members of the platform, and allowing those traceable exchanges to occur. So really, we work in 3 stages. So the first is registration of products. So we work with, we interface with ERP systems, so product inventory systems, to draw product information. What happens is once that product is registered within the platform, every single product has this unique cycle code. If I just go back a slide, you can see it in this image here. That code is then placed on a product, and that allows you to interact with that code via a smart device. You can then access information on the provenance of that product and other sustainability data relevant to that particular product. And through that code and interacting with that code, you can unlock product provenance. And you can also allow products to be maintained better, optimized by connecting the manufacturer and the operator through that code. Essentially what happens is the manufacturer can offer you other solutions to improve the servicing and the life of that asset while you have it. So really, we see ourselves as a commercial and sustainability value generator. And we do that by allowing a customer, when they receive a product, to maximize the value or to optimize the usability of that product. So it runs the way it's supposed to run for as long as possible. And that's through better access to product maintenance, repairability kits, all of these things that can be obtained through this new direct relationship that happens between the manufacturer and the end user once that code is scanned. That also increases asset performance during its life. And then once you've serviced that product or had improvement works conducted to that product, that whole log of product servicing can then be uploaded into the platform. So with that code comes all of the product documentation, service history, all of those things, and it will continuously follow that product around. So that actually optimizes the resale value of that product as well once it comes onto the platform for second life. And as a result of that, being able to monitor and understand where that product goes actually will help you to unlock better reporting from a whole life cost perspective and carbon emissions. So really, to quote what Richard said about cultural change, Loop Cycle is a tool for cultural change, because the way we see this is that if we're going to actually unlock this circular economy and allow net zero carbon economy to be achieved, you actually have to have a mix of people, products and processes. So our platform is designed to enable a system to be formed through which traceability allows this product to be traced from one use to the other and then recovered by the manufacturer at end of life. Because by doing that, you unlock all kinds of commercial opportunities, but ultimately you enable that product to go back to a place where it can be recycled, refurbished, and then released again into a second life market, or actually recycled into a brand new product. So we see ourselves very much as an ecosystem of shared value. So really, that's just a really quick 5-minute summary of what we do and how we work and the opportunities that we can unlock. We're really keen as a new entrant to Make UK to understand the challenges of the manufacturers that are in this sector, to see how actually circular value can be unlocked through traceability of products through this value chain. So happy to have those conversations after this session. So thank you very much for having us along.
That's absolutely excellent. Thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. However, before we do jump to the questions, I know I'm a bit conscious that we need to do a quick snap poll about today's event, and then we'll jump back on for those who want to hang back. We've got a little bit of extra time where you can stop and talk it through, but for those who need to get away, we'll just run that snap poll now, if that's okay with you, Brigitte.
It is okay, but do I have to relaunch the polling? No, that's poll 1. So I'm trying again. Poll 2. Yep, there we go. So I'm launching. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Polling's come up. So if everybody wants to just quickly run through those questions, and Brigitte will.
Yeah.
Okay, how are we doing as everybody?
We've got 61%. I think one more minute. So I think we can already comment because there's a massive overwhelming yes for first question. So everyone is more inclined now to engage with their supply chain on their carbon footprint, which is really good news. So it means we've managed to demystify a little bit, and with the inspiring stories of Crystal Doors and the tools of Loop Cycle. So that's very good. And clearly there's, for question 2, there's clearly, yeah, it's a bit daunting clearly because the supply chains are big. Oops, sorry. Are big indeed and very large, but I'm sure we will be able to help you. And then I would point you to the toolkit actually, which I hope Adam can say a couple of words on this. And finally, yes, precisely. If you would be interested in a discussion with energy and carbon management on the Net Zero Toolkit, which can help you certainly with all this process, well, please do contact us. So I'll stop sharing here. And I think we're at the Q&A, more Q&A if we have more questions. So I know we're a little bit over time.
Let's go over to Annette. Annette,
yeah, there are a number of questions in the chat. One came in very early from Andy Fitzsimon, who is part of the Processing and Packaging Machinery Trade Association. And his comment was that currently the legislation only requires larger organizations to comply. So what would the panel say would be the advice to business with the workforce under 250 for the SME community?
So the advice, so as it stands, disclosing emissions, yeah, it's not a mandatory requirement. I think they're more likely to get kind of pushed to do it voluntarily by their own customers. So they'll be supplying bigger organizations and they'll be asked for this data. We have various customers that are either doing streamlined energy and carbon reporting or basic carbon footprint voluntarily for that purpose. You can also just do a bit like Richard was saying, you can do it for your own purposes. If you're measuring your energy consumption and your transport fuel consumption, etc., you've pretty much done it already. You just need to add it all up and publish it. Does that make sense? In terms of scope 3, it will be harder and take longer, but more and more tools are being made available, either paid for or free to use to help you have a stab at it. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has a free carbon calculator on their website. We help our clients to use it, for example, as a first step.
Okay.
Sorry, I'd just like to add, sorry, to that question, that the government is pushing very hard for all SMEs to join the Race to Zero, and particularly the Climate Hub commitment. The Climate Hub, which is the promotion campaign for the COP26. Obviously, UK is very invested in that, and they see that the industry and manufacturing sector can help them demonstrate that, you know, it's possible to do it and be profitable. So, and of course, if you do sign up, which we also support that campaign and would encourage everyone, there is a commitment to actually halve your emissions by 2030 and report annually. So I know it's not mandatory, but you can see there is a push there, and the reports are of course rather informal and light, but you know, that's the trend certainly.
Brigitte, if I might as well, I think we've talked about this in some of the earlier episodes, but and Richard reinforced this. Richard fell into this out of necessity because actually he needed to solve a problem which fundamentally sorted out the bottom line. And actually let's not lose sight of the fact that for most of us on the call here, the biggest emitters are somewhere in your products or the raw material, or it'll be your process, your energy consumption. And actually, if you can continue to make improvements in the amount of power that it takes to create the product, then you're going to actually have a positive impact on the business from a pure pound notes point of view. So actually, there are better than incidental benefits by doing this. This is about good business practice. The carbon footprinting element is actually the icing on the cake. So especially if you're not compelled to do this, potentially think about doing it for the right reasons, and also make sure you get a baseline year before you start doing the things to drive down your energy. Don't start doing projects and then start taking a baseline. You might have missed your big step change that you want to shout about.
Thank you very much. And then another one is, in a net zero scenario, will a business be expected to pay to offset Scope 3 emissions?
I think we answered that one, but basically probably not. No, we might get to the point where when there already are taxes on Scope 1 and 2 emissions, things like the EU ETS. There was the CRC, which has ended. That they're not offsetting schemes, but they're an example of how taxes or levies might be placed on emissions. I don't expect there will be a legal requirement to offset Scope 3 emissions. We may see that change as time goes by, but if everyone's managing and neutralising their own Scope 1 and 2 emissions, or potentially just Scope 1, then that takes care of Scope 3 itself, doesn't it? There was a few other questions which I've answered in the chat, but I'm happy to talk through them again.
The circular economy come a couple of times here, and how this...
Yeah, how does this fit into the circular economy? So if you mean, how can you use life cycle assessments to calculate carbon footprints? I mean, essentially, yes. I'm not personally an expert on LCAs, but if you're tracking what happens to a product from cradle to grave and maybe back to cradle again, you can look at the energy and carbon inputs along the way, and that's essentially the I think I call it the greenhouse gas product inventory, the best, most accurate way of measuring your Scope 3 for a product. It's essentially a life cycle assessment. So they're very relevant, is my understanding of it.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
I think, unless I've missed any obvious ones here, this has covered.
Yeah, there was one about how.
There's one about the steel mills, isn't there? I think from Robert Bryan at
yeah.
Again, to the Scope 3, wasn't it? If steel can actually properly.
Yeah, and I think in principle, Robert, I mean, how do you affect Scope 3? As Richard actually, I know scale kind of changes, but as Richard says, it's about trying to influence behaviour. I mean, you can't truly affect the Scope 3 emissions of the steel mills worldwide, but you can seek a better way or the most efficiently created product that works for you. But this all comes back to fundamentally looking after your own Scope 1 and 2. So actually, you can affect how you then impart energy onto the product as you've received it. And therefore, if you continue to look after your own Scope 1 and 2 emissions, you continue to drive the improvements. Meanwhile, the steel mills themselves are trying to dramatically change the way that they produce the product and look after their Scope 1. And the more people that are asking, applying pressure where they can, it becomes a collective effort to that impact, and its behaviour drives behaviour to some extent.
Yeah, I say, Adam, I've summarised that in the chat actually, but other than choosing a lower carbon steel supplier, using a bit less steel in whatever you're manufacturing, could you replace it with a different product that's less carbon intensive? I'm no expert, but maybe, or lighter products. I know there's already lots of drives for that already. But as Adam says, it's about sending signals to the market and ultimately relying on government policy to really have the biggest impact on steel manufacturing, I would say. There was one other question about how would you count a carbon footprint for an industrial process?
I was just about asking that. Yeah, that's quite a tricky one, isn't it?
I think mean, that's a bit of an open question, but I think what you mean is how would you measure the carbon footprint of a particular product line or a certain site? So you basically need to measure the electricity and gas and other fuels that are used in that process, whether that's a whole building or sub-metering or looking at the invoices. You need to consider any fugitive emissions of things like refrigerant gases, SF6, anything that happens in the plastics industry in particular may release greenhouse gases that aren't just carbon dioxide, methane. And then that will give you the carbon footprint over a period of time. You can then normalize it. So you divide the total emissions per unit manufactured or per ton of product produced. And that is the carbon footprint of your industrial process, essentially. Hope that answers the question.
Excellent. I'm kind of guessing that unless anybody else wants to shout up, that's still remaining in here. I suppose it's just for me to hope that everybody found today's workshop beneficial. I know I certainly did, having gone the journey with you on these and seeing 1 and 2 become 3 and how 3 is sort of wrapped around 1. It's really, really been very interesting. Massive thank you to Richard from Crystal Doors and Lugano from Loop Cycle. I think you've stepped up and you give some information there, and it's just a pity we hadn't had more time today, because I think this part of the subject is so interesting, and I think you could build a lot more on this. Adam and Daniel from Energy and Carbon Management, your expertise again outstanding, and want to thank you for attending and participating, and obviously working with us on our net zero carbon document that we have worked in collaboration to build with you. And just to remind those of you remaining that the next workshop is on the 29th of June. I think we've got a morning one, that one, Brigitte, 10 o'clock in the morning, and we'll be focusing on reporting and communications. And we'll send all the information out from today's event over hopefully the next 24 hours, because we've got a couple of delays on some things that I need to get done. And what will happen is you'll get a copy of the slides, and those with agreement as a PDF. We'll also send you any contact information deemed relevant. So unless anybody else has anything to ask or say at this point, everybody happy with that?
Thank you.
Yeah, good. So if I can just ask the presenters to stay behind, and we'll just have a little wrap up, and we'll allow everybody to go.